Your son, he's a suspect.
In the murder? I want him back. And if there's any way, I don't want him to go to jail.
$2,000 up front, then. Cash.
Hi, I'm Liz.
And I'm Kevin, and we are here with writer, director, author John Sayles. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Your newest film is Go for Sisters. What inspired you to tell that story?
I was fascinated with this idea of a parole officer. A really good parole officer is kind of half social worker, half cop, and they have to use sometimes with the same client, both of those sides. But I got interested in the idea of having that kind of power over another human being. And that combined in my head with this idea of two women who had been, went to Compton High School here in LA together, were so tight that they could go for sisters, and then lose track of each other for a long time, and then are reunited years and years later. One's a parole officer and one just got out of jail, and they've been assigned to each other. And what that kind of power shift does to a relationship, and is there any way these people can get back together and be friends again? Or even more importantly, find that person they used to be who they liked a lot better than they like themselves now.
How did the script change from, the story about the probation officer to what it became?
Well, one thing that happened is I had this other idea about a disbarred LAPD detective who had kind of lost his job, not because he was a bad guy, but because he kind of followed the code and didn't rat on a friend of his who was taking some bribes. And I suddenly realized I could combine these two stories. So a story that's kind of binary, all of a sudden there's a triangle, which makes the writing and the dynamic of the scenes much more interesting.
Right.
What pushes you to continue to tell these stories?
Well, in general, I'm just interested in people and storytelling, and I'm interested in things that I know enough about to be interested in, but not enough about to feel like I really understand them. And so in a lot of ways, the process for me of researching it, writing it, shooting it, editing it is just discovery of how would people think and how would they act and who are these people. This particular movie, Go for Sisters, there's the practical element, which is that I have a lot of stories I want to tell and many screenplays I've already written. What can I afford? Because it's a movie that I was able to self-finance by writing screenplays for other people. And I kind of looked at, oh, geez, that's all the money I got, and what could I do? I'm going to have to keep this. It's still ambitious for an under $1 million movie, but it's what I could do with what I had.
You do a lot of script rewrites and you write films for other people, and you seem to do a lot of genre films. What attracts you to that?
Genre is interesting in that you can explore other things within the genre. So you use the genre, you don't let it use you. Mm-hmm. And so you do some surprising things, some interesting character things. I remember Kurt Vonnegut talked about how science fiction is the most philosophical genre because it's all what if.
I personally want to ask the question about Night Skies and how that came about and how that transformed into E.T.
That was a script that I wrote. It was kind of based on some research that Steven Spielberg had done for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And the studio they were at that moment said, we're not so sure about this whole science fiction thing, and kind of passed on it. I think they also had Starman, brewing. And I went off and did other things and was unavailable because I was making a movie. And then the Writers Guild contacts you if you had anything to do with a script that's about to come out as a movie. And they see if you want credit on it. Spielberg's people sent me Melissa Matheson's script for E.T., which I think at that time was called A Boy's Own Story to disguise what it was about, so there wouldn't be 100 TV movies about extraterrestrials. And as a screenwriter for hire, mostly what I read is screenplays that seriously need work. And so I'm reading this thing. I said, boy, this is really good. This is like the best screenplay I've ever read. And if Mr. Spielberg, can keep the budget down, this would be a nice little Disney movie. And truly the only point of intersection was the very last scene in Night Skies was the one nice E.T. who didn't want to carve up the little autistic boy, just like they'd been mutilating the cattle and horses, gets left behind because he's not mean enough by the meaner ones. And the last line of my script was something like "a stranger in a strange land." And, the first scene of E.T. is that. But then it goes in a totally different direction. So I said, well, obviously, I'm not going to ask for credit on this. And I want to see this movie.
Right. That's fascinating.
What did you think of the new Piranha?
I haven't seen them. I hadn't even seen Piranha 2: The Spawning, which James Cameron directed, which he often does not include in his resume.
His oeuvre.
It's when they mate with the flying fish so they can jump and hit in the thing. I wrote The Howling as well, which is a werewolf thing. I think they made 7 or 8 Howlings, and I haven't seen any of those either. Pretty much when I'm done with it, is they can have there was an alligator too, and I if I'm not asked to write the sequel, I don't need to see it.
Nice.
So you got your start working for Roger Corman and doing super low-budget films, working with him. Would you say that there's any comparable training ground for young filmmakers today?
I don't think there's anybody who's making a lot of movies hiring people right out of college or, because they made an interesting short that played in a film festival and paying them.
What I find really interesting when I see your films is the range of really great, sometimes lesser-known actors. So how do you go about finding your cast?
I do casting. I still do casting. On Go for Sisters, for instance, I had to do it remote. I only got to be in the room with a few people because I was on the East Coast and I needed to cast people in the Los Angeles area because I couldn't afford to fly them to the set. And I knew I was going to shoot out here. But I could also afford to fly myself out here and audition people. So it's one of the first time that 90% of my casting was either people I just made offers to because I knew their work or people who put themselves on tape. I occasionally get a day player job as an actor, and I very often cast people who were in the same movie with me because they're auditioning for me without knowing it. I say, oh boy, that guy's good, or she's good. Before I start any movie, I read over all my casting sheets from the other 17 movies that I made, and Yolanda Ross is a good example. She came in to read for the part that Lisa Gay Hamilton got in our movie Honey Dripper. And I just wrote, this is an incredible actress. You've got to work with her sometime. And so when this thing came up, I just thought, I know who I want to cast.
So you act and you write short stories and you wrote a novel and
several novels, yeah.
Several novels.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you get out of every medium?
When I act, it's really useful for me as a writer and a director. The first thing an actor does is figure out, how does my character see the world? What don't they hear? What do they hear? What do they notice? What do they not notice? What are their opinions? And where do those come from? And that's all writing. The difference for me in working in fiction and in movies, in fiction you get to be God. In my last novel, A Moment in the Sun, I have 2 major wars. So I could have Admiral Dewey sink the Spanish fleet, and I don't have to think about how we're going to get those period ships. But you're basically doing it alone. You have that power, but it's only what you can think up. When you make a movie, you have a lot less power. Planes come, interrupt you, the sun goes down, all kinds of practical things get in the way of you doing exactly what you want to do. But you have actors who can do things you can't do. You have a composer who can do things you can't do, production designer, cinematographer. There's all these really talented people who have skills in their area way beyond yours, and you get to choose.
So what was your favorite film that came out this year?
It hasn't come out yet, but because I know one of the actors, I get to see a screening of Osage County. And it's just incredible acting. Meryl Streep is wonderful again. And there's a really, really strong cast, and they all do very, very good work. So that was kind of inspiring to see a bunch of actors get together and really listen to each other.
Well, thank you for coming and speaking with us today. It was a blast. And we'd like to end with our traditional cheers.
And the Mexican version is pa arriba, pa abajo, pa centro, al dentro.
Cheers.
Cheers.